So my name is Dax D'Orazio, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta. And it's both a pleasure and an honor to be with you all and also to moderate today's event. Before we get into it, I'm going to offer something brief to give participants some additional context for the presentations and ensuing discussion, and then I'll introduce each of our panelists. And from there, we'll have some short presentations from each of the panelists, approximately 5 to 8 minutes, a chance for the panelists to respond to each other and also field a couple questions from me. And then we'll open it up to the traditional Q&A portion. So a bit of context to start. Freedom of expression is a perennial question for philosophers and policymakers alike. Contemporary debates and discussions about the reasonable limits of expression increasingly revolve around one particular venue, the university campus. In particular, the idea that the contemporary state of freedom of expression on campus constitutes a crisis has gained some impressive momentum, in part spurred by a raft of controversies across North America. Sensing the wind at their back, majority conservative governments in Alberta and Ontario made unprecedented policy moves in 2018 and 2019. Jason Kenney's United Conservative Party and Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives issued ministerial directives compelling all post-secondary institutions in their respective provinces to create new or amend existing freedom of expression policy statements. Every post-secondary institution in Alberta and Ontario acquiesced, and suddenly the alleged free speech crisis was no longer a consistent complaint in the op-ed pages. It was now official government policy. At the heart of the ministerial directives is what's been dubbed the Chicago Principles, an institutional policy statement from a 2015 Committee on Freedom of Expression and University of Chicago report. Hailed by some as the gold standard for freedom of expression policy in higher education, it soon morphed from something proprietary at the University of Chicago to a national campaign for adoption at other institutions. But while institutions were encouraged to voluntarily endorse the Chicago Principles, when they came to Canada, they essentially became a provincial government fiat. Responses to the ministerial directives were as sharp as they were predictable. For some, they were a necessary and minimally intrusive antidote for rapidly deteriorating state of freedom of expression on university campuses. For others, they were a crass partisan gesture aimed at solidifying an erroneous public perception of higher education and one that might provide greater latitude for harmful expression on campus. Irrespective of your view, the ministerial directives are an important policy change. They represent a significant departure from traditional institutional independence from government, long held as essential for higher education. Further, they've created a much stronger nexus between universities and government, a crucial prerequisite for the potential application of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to university campuses. For their part, universities have often struggled to resolve an inherent tension related to expression on campus. On the one hand, universities are reflexively understood as the most fitting venue for difficult, controversial, and uncomfortable debate and discussion. Accordingly, universities have some of the most robust policies and practices supporting freedom of expression, including the special protection of academic freedom. On the other hand, however, universities cannot carry out their educative mission without cultivating an environment that is free from discrimination and harassment. Accordingly, universities can legitimately restrict expression if and when it is likely to interfere with normal university operations or it poses a significant risk to the campus community. How the ministerial directives and the Chicago Principles might actually change freedom of expression on campus remains to be seen. So, to help us make sense of these tensions, questions, and events on campus, we've assembled an impressive panel of experts and scholars. Our first panelist is Samir Gandesha. Samir is the director of the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. He has an MA and PhD from York University and held a postdoc at the University of California, Berkeley. He's been teaching at SFU since 2003 and been the director in the humanities since 2010. He's the editor of numerous refereed journal articles in top-tier journals, chapters in edited volumes, and encyclopedia entries. He is also co-editor of Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations from Stanford University Press, and co-editor of Spell of Capital, Reification and Spectacle from the University of Amsterdam Press, and Aesthetic Marx from Bloomsbury Press. More recently, he has edited Spectres of Fascism, Historical, Theoretical, and International Perspectives from Pluto Press, and co-edited Crossing Borders, Essays in Honor of Ian H. Angus, Beyond Phenomenology and Critique from Arbeiter Ring Press. He regularly writes for popular audiences and publications such as Open Democracy, Art Papers, Canadian Dimension, Espace Art Actuel, Truth Out, the Vancouver Sun, the Globe and Mail, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Next, we have Richard Moon, who I haven't seen, but I'm hoping has either joined us or will be joining us very soon. Richard is Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Law at the University of Windsor. His research focuses on freedom of expression and freedom of conscience and religion. He is the author of Putting Faith in Hate When Religion is the Source or Target of Hate Speech from Cambridge University Press, Freedom of Conscience and Religion from Irwin Law, The Constitutional Protection of Freedom of Expression from the University of Toronto Press, and the report to the Canadian Human Rights Commission concerning Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act and the regulation of hate speech on the internet. Editor of Law and Religious Pluralism in Canada from UBC Press, co-editor of Religion and the Exercise of Public Authority from Hart Bloomsbury, and contributing editor to Canadian Constitutional Law, 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions from Iman Montgomery. Next, we have Katja Thieme. Katja teaches discourse analysis, academic writing, and interdisciplinary studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She holds a cross appointment at the School of Journalism, Writing and Media, the English Department, and Vantage College. She has a research background in the rhetoric of political movements, and her more recent work focuses on conditions of knowledge making and aspects of research writing in a range of fields such as literary studies, trans studies, and Indigenous studies. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Cara Zwibel. Cara is the director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She was called to the Ontario Bar in 2005. She has a political science degree from McGill University and law degrees from Osgoode Hall Law School, an LLB, and New York University, an LLM. Her work with the CCLA involves providing legal opinions and research, coordinating litigation and interventions, representing CCLA before the courts, preparing submissions to legislative bodies, and assisting with the CCLET's public education work. Before joining the CCLA, Cara clerked at the Supreme Court of Canada and worked at a large national law firm practicing public law, health law, and commercial litigation. So we will start with the short presentations in the same order of the introductions. Samir, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Dax, for the introduction, for organizing this, I think, very important panel. I also like to thank David as well for what seems like a very impressive speaker series. What I'd like to do really is just address this first question. Is there a crisis of freedom of expression on the campus? But before I come to the question, I would like to also acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. My first point, I suppose, is that pressures on freedom of expression and academic freedom by extension on Canadian campuses, or let's say Ontario campuses, is nothing particularly new. I was extremely concerned by the Ontario government's 1993 zero tolerance for offensive speech framework when I was a graduate student in political science at York University. And I recall at the time wondering how I, as a TA or a lecturer, could teach under such policy. So how would one, for example, teach the politics of the Middle East? Or how would one teach the politics of gender and feminism under such a policy? How could there be zero tolerance for offensive speech? Because when you're talking about politics in particular, you're talking about different kinds of positions, you're talking about conflict, you're talking about different definitions of interest and so on. And inevitably somebody is going to take offense with something that is said. And little could I have actually known how consequential this problem, in a sense of the possibility of giving offense, would become in our contemporary period, right? So several decades later. I had seen the various tensions inherent in these different kinds of positions that get taken up on the university campus as the director of the Institute for the Humanities. As Dax pointed out, I've been doing that job for around 10 years. And I can safely say that we've been criticized from all quarters for the kinds of things that we've done. And I actually think that that means we're doing good work. We do have to raise controversial and difficult kinds of questions, and we've been challenged for it. But we've stuck to our guns, and the university has defended us. And I think that what we're seeing in the university is a more generalized kind of phenomenon of a tendency to try to shut down speakers that people disagree with. This is often referred to as deplatforming or no platforming. It's sensationalistically referred to as cancel culture. And I don't think this is undescriptive of what's going on. I think it really is some real truth to this designation of cancel culture. It gets sensationalized and weaponized in a way by the media, particularly the conservative media, but I do think there is a problem here. We see this as a most recent example in the delay or possible cancellation of the work of Philip Guston, a visual artist who addresses racism and the KKK in particular. And the concern here is that this would be too sensitive or possibly too controversial in our contemporary era of Black Lives Matter, of justifiable concerns about violence that is visited upon Black and Indigenous communities in particular. We see this coming on the heels of other controversies that I've written on, for example, Hannah Black's open letter asking for the destruction of Dana Schutz's depiction of Emmett Till, as well as the covering over now of the mural by Victor Arnautoff in San Francisco at Washington High School that depicts George Washington's role in the Republic's brutal westward expansion. This was a piece of art that had real critical intention, really rubbing history against the grain to reveal the kind of mythological basis of American history and of American exceptionalism. But it was shut down because it was said to be too offensive, too traumatic for the communities that were depicted in the view of some in an unflattering way. What has motivated such moves towards cancel culture, in my view, is an overinflated view of harm and the attempt to shield viewers from what is considered to be, by some, too traumatic and too offensive expressions and representations. However, in my view, and I can come back to this later on, is that the cure is far worse than the disease. And so-called cancel culture has also entered into the university. I think the most infamous example was a case of Lindsay Shepherd, whose details are well enough known for me not to go into them in any great detail. As a kind of sidebar to that, a colleague at Ryerson recently told me that Jordan Peterson was scheduled to give a talk on campus one day, and a female colleague of his said that his very presence on campus made her feel unsafe. Again, I think this is a real overinflation of the possibility of harm, and I think overinflated concern with safety and so on. I would suggest, in contrast to that sort of view, we need to have a much more robust challenge to the views of the Jordan Petersons of this world, objectionable as they may be to some people. And this is to debate their ideas robustly, as Slavoj Žižek did not too long ago. And he showed that indeed the emperor has no clothes on. And let's face it, Jordan Peterson is far too quick to be an advocate for the excision of entire fields and disciplines in schools from the university, to be a bona fide proponent of freedom of expression and academic freedom that he purports to be. So I think when we start challenging figures like this, we show them in all their cynicism and internal contradictions. Now, one may be able to empathize with the position that we need to be careful about the kinds of offense and harm that can be done by certain forms of speech. I myself am less sympathetic to this view because I think the university is really the place where we do need to have robust exchange of ideas based on the giving and taking of reasons and evidence. And I think this is one thing that the university must claim for itself as the specificity of the university as an institution. There are ways in which, if we don't adhere to this, the left can be deeply damaged by attempts to, overextend harm and so on. I can give a number of examples, but I think I'm kind of coming to the end of my time. So I would say that one of the most egregious ones that we face today is the widespread adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, which equates it with criticism of the state of Israel. In particular, an example that's given on the website is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. That itself is anti-Semitic. So you can see the kind of chilling impact that this would have within the university. There can't be a discussion about the way in which, for example, Israel, like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, could be considered a settler colonial state. Settler colonialism is based, one could argue, on a certain kind of racist discourse, which justifies it. This is ruled out in advance, and I think this is very, very problematic. So essentially, if on the left, we abandon a principled defense of free speech or freedom of expression and academic freedom. And by principled, I mean the right of those with whom you disagree to say what they want, to make their arguments. Then we end up going down the path of being subjected to these kinds of directives, the kinds of guidelines that have been established in Ontario by the Order in Council, accepting the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. And this is what I mean by the fact that, or when I say that the cure is worse than the disease. This is something, so we need really to defend very strongly and robustly a principled defense, or articulate a principled defense of freedom of expression and also academic freedom. So I think I'm at the end of my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samir. Lots to dig into there. I'm glad to see Richard Moon has managed to get into the Zoom chat. So Richard, you were slated to be next, and we've already done the introductions. If you wouldn't mind, we are doing the 5 to 8 minute introductory remarks. So please go ahead and welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry to be a latecomer. Zoom seemed determined to lock me out, but thanks to some help, I'm here. So I apologize for obviously not having heard what's come before exactly, but it sounds like we're just beginning in any event. So I'm grateful for that. So, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I'm sure, again, in the introduction, you acknowledged or at least noted that in a couple of provinces, Ontario and Alberta in particular, the government has required universities to put in place free speech policies. I mean, the reality is most universities had some form of free speech policy, either consolidated in one place or at least located in a variety of places. But in particular, the provinces of Ontario and Quebec have said that the guiding principles ought to be the Chicago principles. And I'll just say something very quickly about that, and I'm sure this is something we may be able to talk about later. I mean, the Chicago principles, of course, very much reflect the jurisprudence of the First Amendment, the free speech right in the US Bill of Rights, and which is a very libertarian conception of free speech, focused on or permitting a very narrow category of limits on defamation, on harassment that is ongoing, on what they would describe as true threats. And it would not, on the surface, at least on the face of it, permit the restriction of hate speech, for example. Now, the Chicago principles do have a particular clause that refers to the exclusion of unlawful speech. So, of course, in Canada, that would include hate speech. But it's hardly the appropriate starting point for a free speech policy generally, let alone a free speech policy within the university context. Now, the other thing to open with is to recognize or acknowledge that if you're reading the media, you would have the impression there's some kind of free speech crisis on campus, that, you know, everywhere free speech is being overridden, abused, ignored, whatever. And it strikes me that these instances, these controversies around free speech are probably no more frequent and no more severe than they were in the past. But of course, we're hearing more about them, and we're hearing more about them because they are now placed or now understood or framed as part of a larger conflict between the kind of polarized left and polarized right. They fit into a narrative of culture wars of some sort. Now, of course, as soon as you place them in that narrative, they do change or can change their character. They get understood or framed in those terms. And that, in fact, can have the consequence of taking disagreements that may have occurred in the past that could have been worked out, not always to everyone's satisfaction, of course, but worked out in some practical way, now viewed as somehow intractable, as foundational or fundamental, as part of this larger conflict. Now, the other claim I want to make is that we talk about a free speech crisis, but in fact, there's not really a free speech crisis. What there is a crisis in public discourse. And at least not if we're using the term free speech in the familiar way of thinking about or referring to state censorship of individual expression or group expression in some way. As I say, instead, what we have is a crisis in public discourse that's been reduced or transmuted into a free speech crisis. That if we think of the issue or the problem before us as simply one of censorship, then I think we misunderstand the problem and we offer or end up coming up with inappropriate solutions of different kinds. The problem increasingly is our unwillingness or an inability to engage with one another. It is also rests upon, or the problem is that we no longer have a kind of shared understanding or a shared agreement of some kind about what are reliable or trusted sources of information. And finally, we see the openness, the easy spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories, and the openness that an increasing number of people seem to have to these, to this disinformation or conspiracy theories in general. I still have some time, I assume. Okay. I want to say a little bit more then, particularly about the university context. When we talk about free speech in Canada, or freedom of expression, the term we generally use, the freedom is subject to relatively few restrictions, relatively few content restrictions, hate speech, defamation, and so forth, and restrictions that may be based on the time and place at which expression can occur to ensure that conflicting uses of property space can be reconciled in different ways. Now, of course, expression may be subject to greater limits when it occurs within a particular institutional context. And I think that it's important to recognize that within different institutions, such as a workplace, we have different expectations or standards around respect, civility, racist expression that may not be subject to hate speech laws, but may be understood as entirely inappropriate within the context of a workplace, a closed space, a hierarchical structure, and so forth. So when we get to the university, well, the university, of course, is an institution in which we say the free exchange of ideas and information is vital and ought to be protected. But the university is not simply a public forum like the streets and parks. It's a workplace. It's a place of learning. And sometimes we talk about its purpose as discovery and dissemination of knowledge through research and learning. And this, of course, requires that the university community, members of it, be free to explore and advance ideas and information that may sometimes be controversial, unconventional in different ways. But this also, I think, means that faculty and students should be expected to adhere to certain standards of communicative engagement. And in particular, the members of the academic community should be treated as interlocutors. That is, conversation partners who should be addressed and heard. Now, this doesn't address all of the difficult issues, far from it. It remains a very general or abstract commitment, but it means at least speech that questions the standing of some members of the community should not be considered acceptable within the university context. Now, the other important point to make, and the last point I'll make, is the university, of course, is the site of multiple locations of conversation or discussion. And it's important to recognize that our standards of speech, our expectations of civility and respect are different in these different sites of conversation. What goes on in the classroom and what we expect in the classroom is different. We expect some degree of civility, respect, some engagement on the topic in hand, for example, because the classroom is a structured environment with hierarchy, a closed space in which students are expected to be present. We may have, obviously, in the meeting room, similar expectations around civility and engagement. Maybe in the residence where people live, they should be free from certain kinds of expression that may be attack or question their standing or character. Now, and I won't say anything more about this because I think this is the important point of conversation or discussion. When we talk about extracurricular speakers who are invited in, or when we talk about the open spaces of the campus that look like parks and streets, it may be that the standards of civility, respect, the protection of free speech looks more like what we might expect to be protected out in the larger public sphere. Anyway, I've stumbled through all that, and that's all I'll say for now. There's lots more to say as we proceed, and I look forward to hearing everybody else.
Thanks very much, Richard, and I'm glad you eventually made it in. Okay, so next we have Katja. Please go ahead, Katja.
Yes, hello. So thank you for inviting me to the panel. Like Samir, I'm also speaking from Vancouver, or from the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nation. I have some scripted remarks. I'm a committed script reader. So when in August 2018, the Ontario government took the unprecedented step of mandating that all Ontario universities instate a free speech policy, that governmental demand referenced the free speech crisis, which seems to be oddly and strangely confined to higher education. So if a government is concerned about free speech, why only on campuses? And as far as I can tell, with that demand came no basis in current fact. So there weren't any facts presented to us. Despite several student societies protesting, the leadership of universities and colleges did not stand up to the challenge of their autonomy. And since then, something similar has happened in Alberta under Premier Jason Kenney. So I would say these attempts by both premiers go first against the autonomous status of universities and colleges, and second against the need for Canadian institutions to think through implications of free speech in relationship to other rights and values that are also rooted on campuses and within Canadian legal frameworks. I will focus my remarks with some details from UBC because that is what I'm most familiar with. And I want to mention that at UBC, a lot of discussion on academic freedom and free speech was precipitated with a case of infringement on academic freedom, the case of Jennifer Bardal, and the following fact-finding process and report by the Honorable Lynn Smith, as well as with extensive organizing activity by 2 free speech clubs that we have on campus. More generally, it's become quite a custom in any discussion on free speech to pair together and tease apart the 2 freedoms. What is academic freedom? What is freedom of expression? And how do they relate? So it suits us to keep the need to protect academic freedom and other values in our sight when debating freedom of expression more generally. So I would say, echoing Richard's remarks, and I actually took this idea from Richard's scholarship, universities have public spaces, and that is not exactly the same as, for instance, the university structures and buildings, and different rules might apply. I would point to the British Columbia University Act that governs all universities in the province. And in section 47, it speaks of the functions and duties of a university, that they include establishing and maintaining facilities for instruction and original research in all branches of knowledge. So according to the University Act, that is the priority. Public space is not mentioned in relationship to those structures and facilities. So there's a possibility here that speech that is invited into university spaces can conflict with the mandate of instruction and original research as it is understood by current discipline-specific perspectives. In 2018, UBC had a working group that produced a Freedom Matters statement, which emphasizes that learning and research are the central goals of the university and that they require an inclusive, collaborative, and innovative environment. The statement then asserts that freedom of expression inside university spaces cannot be limited only by criminal law or the BC Human Rights Code, that it must hold imbalanced legal and moral responsibilities as it works to provide a respectful, constructive, and inclusive environment for all. That universities need to maintain an inclusive environment for productive use of freedom of expression has been highlighted in most scholarship on the topic. And that's Canadian and US scholarship. However, despite recognizing that there are conflicts arising, for instance, for those whose fundamental ways of existing are brought into question by some speaker's speech, most scholarship simply discusses that conflict and does not suggest ways to address it. In the end, a more absolutist free speech practice is often assumed or asserted, especially in policy statements like the Chicago Statement. And there's an assertion that free speech trumps all other rights. The work of pushing back against speech that, for instance, valorizes white supremacy or transphobia is thereby often delegated to those most vulnerable to the harm and intimidation these claims produce. The committee that wrote the Chicago Principles explicitly states in its report that, quote, "It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to act, not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose," end quote. So the suggestion is fight it out amongst yourselves, says the Chicago Committee. Don't look to the university for a role in resolving any conflicts between competing rights. So that can be somewhat a frustrating impasse in some situations, when many arguments that explicitly mention impediments to inclusive practices of free speech shy away from considering possible changes, approaches, or policies that might address these conflicts. A key challenge is that the repeatedly stated commitment to learning and research in an inclusive environment can require some limits to speech. This might be speech in university buildings, but is also and now more clearly speech in online meeting places, including when these online meeting places are facilitated by private companies. The criminal code and provincial human rights codes are not written with the university's particular mandate of learning and research in mind. So these legal codes cannot fully answer the question of what limitations on speech might be necessary in cases where other rights and values conflict with freedom of expression. At UBC, when several cases of free speech events did not go ahead, it was not due to the substantial concerns or the researched evidence that were brought forward against the invited speech in question. We actually had a Freedom of Information request for one of these events that seemed to lie at the borderline for many people. And the university, in conversations with the Board of Governors, only referenced pro and con comments made in the letters that were written, some of them quite detailed and well researched, and did not address the concerns. So when some of these events did not go ahead at UBC, it was security assessment that led to a limit on speech being asserted. I would say that security concerns should not be the leading mechanism that define for us how to resolve our conflicts and what limits might be asserted in relationship to speakers who come with often passionate campaigns that in some ways might go against the rights of some university members or against the mandate that organizes the university. And nor should it be profit-oriented decisions by private companies like Zoom that assert limits to speech through decisions that lie entirely outside our institutions. In contrast to what the Chicago principles state, I suggest Canadian universities need to be able to decide for themselves what might be appropriate measures, or decide not to have any change in measures to be able to protect their mandate of research and learning and to resolve conflicts we encounter between different rights and values. We need to be able to arrive at these measures through policy processes that secure our institutional autonomy. And by that, I don't mean administration, I mean faculty and students, and without interference from provincial and federal governments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katja. And next we have Cara. Please go ahead, Cara.
Thank you. Thanks to Dax and David for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm always a little bit both flattered and intimidated when I'm the sole non-academic on a panel. So I hope you'll be gentle with me. And also I'll apologize in advance, but I think my children are exercising their own freedom of expression rather loudly at the moment, so hopefully they won't interrupt us. So I mean, I approach this, as far as the question around whether there's this crisis of freedom of expression on campus, and I have to say that I think what constitutes a crisis in my mind has probably changed a fair bit over the last couple of months that we've lived through. But I think even pre-pandemic, I would have likely said that there is no free expression crisis on Canada's university campuses. And that's not to say that there are not serious issues related to freedom of expression that give rise to debates, controversies, and sometimes scandals on campus. But for me, what is happening on campuses is a reflection of what's happening in many other parts of society, which is a few things, I guess. First, a fundamental misunderstanding about what freedom of expression means, what it protects, the limits that it's subject to, and how it needs to be and very often can be reconciled and balanced with other rights and values that are also constitutionally protected in the Canadian Charter. And fundamentally, I think not just at universities, but in many other venues, we've lost sight of the importance of rigorous and sometimes uncomfortable debate. And we live in a world of extremes where we can sort of choose to reside in echo chambers that serve to affirm all of our beliefs and opinions, or in online environments where shock value is rewarded, where conflict is the norm, and where meaningful debate is non-existent. I think a movement for safe spaces on university campuses that were initially set up to help students who were the targets of harassment and even violence have in some cases morphed into an idea that we have a right to be immunized from exposure to ideas that we find distasteful or hurtful. And I guess I would agree with some of the comments that Samir started with around, the inflation of this idea of harm, and not to discount or even disagree with individuals who experience expression that way. But to say that if we categorize it in that way, if we accept that this is, the equivalent of violence, then it loses protection, right? Even in law, what constitutes the scope of the constitutionally protected right to free expression is relatively broad, but it is circumscribed to say it doesn't include acts of violence. It doesn't include threats of violence. And so if we say that everything that we subjectively experience as harmful or even violent is violence for these purposes, then we don't have that principle of freedom of expression to rely on. So I don't think we have a crisis, but I do think we have a problem. And I'll give an example that I think is sort of emblematic of this issue. And I think it was about a year ago that I was invited to speak as part of a different panel at a law school here in Toronto that also dealt with issues of free expression on campus. And one of the discussion questions that was posed related to the issue of graphic anti-choice or anti-abortion displays on campus. And the question mentioned, in Ontario, we have legislation that creates bubble zones around certain clinical settings where abortions are performed, so that with a view to ensuring that people seeking to access those services can do so safely and without intimidation. And the question that was put forward by students who organized the panel were what lessons from this kind of model, this bubble zone model, were helpful or could be transferred to the university context. And I was surprised and disappointed that a group of obviously very bright and engaged law students saw these situations as remotely comparable, that you enjoyed the same rights walking into your classroom on campus as would someone seeking to access a health service that might be vital to their health and well-being. So I think either we're ignoring the importance of free expression as a principle, or ignoring the vital role that universities play, or maybe a bit of both. But I do think there's a problem worth exploring, even if I wouldn't elevate it to the status of crisis. And I'll just say a couple of things about this idea of governments that have mandated free speech policies. I mean, it appears the irony has been lost on them, the irony that you promote freedom of expression by compelling essentially a particular policy that takes a particular form. I'm, I guess, not particularly troubled by it, partly because I'm not convinced it will make much of a difference. I don't know that the existence of this requirement has changed much on campuses. I think that, as Dick mentioned before, most universities and colleges have these policies already. They may have had to tweak them a bit to line up with the Chicago principles, but I don't think that they had to do a lot of real sort of soul searching to make these changes. And I'm not sure that the follow through on this from the government has been significant. I know that in Ontario, universities are supposed to report annually on sort of how they're doing, and I don't think any huge bombshells have sort of been uncovered in that reporting. I think that these governments need to. Governments that impose these policies on others need to be spending more time looking at what they can do to promote free expression themselves. And also, I think, to the issue around the harm that students on campus, students that are the targets of some of this hurtful expression, the harm that they experience, I think, is I don't want to dismiss it. I think it needs to be considered in the context of institutions that don't reflect the diversity that we see in society, that are not as inclusive and diverse as they need to be. And I think we could do a little more work on that end of things rather than focusing on sort of trying to shut down expressive freedom. the government that required free speech policies here in Ontario for all universities is the same government that just recently adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, which does give rise to very significant freedom of expression concerns around the criticism of Israel. And actually, I've been trying to think about how the government's own adoption of that definition might impact their sort of oversight of university campuses, and that is troubling. So I think that governments need to do a little bit more reflecting on how they can promote freedom of expression, and that seeking to impose it on post-secondary institutions has probably not been the sort of victory that they might have hoped it would be. So I'm happy to leave it there and discuss with others.
Thanks very much, Cara. So now we have about 10 minutes for some discussion among the panelists before we open it up to the Q&A portion. And I wanted to just throw in a few questions that'll try to tie some of the comments together and also respond to some of the prompts that I think you've presented in your excellent presentations. Cara, I think you presented us with a really nice segue when you said that you weren't too worried about the ministerial directives per se, because they might have a negligible, if not non-existent, effect on expression on campus and campus politics, perhaps more broadly. So I wanted to pose that to the other panelists and ask you, what do you think the effect of the ministerial directives in Ontario and Alberta will be for campus expression, either in what you've observed so far or maybe some projections for the future?
So if I could just very, very briefly, I mean, I tend to agree with Cara that I think that the effects will be negligible. I see this as a kind of political theater. It's a way for these conservative governments to position themselves, to grandstand. And I think that, what really should be further remarked upon, and something that Cara was gesturing towards at the end of her presentation, that's the institutional question. And that is, the university has undergone a tremendous transformation over the last 30, 40 years. And this has meant that it has become more like a corporate entity. It has received less public funding and has had to go to donors for more private funding. It's been very beholden to its donors and very, very concerned about what its donors think. There's been an increasing precaritization of academic labor. The institution of tenure is on the decline. There are a number of these kinds of forces that also contribute to significant pressures on academic freedom and freedom of expression within the university, particularly amongst faculty who don't really have any job security, who aren't protected by tenure. And I think this often gets left out of the equation, so it should be brought in. Last point is that I think that we should point precisely to the contradiction in the Ontario government's, on the one hand, defending the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, which has this real chilling effect on academic freedom and free speech, and on the other hand, it's mandating the adoption of the Chicago principles. That's a massive contradiction that we really should push them hard on, and defend the autonomy of the institution, the autonomy of the university. Thanks.
If I can join in too, I certainly agree with what has been said, that the call for these policies has been simply a matter of optics. And I think that was confirmed, as Cara mentioned, by the fact that there has been no meaningful engagement or oversight after the introduction, certainly in Ontario, of these policies. They were submitted, and that seems to be pretty much the end of it. Now, there is one interesting question. It's certainly been argued that the introduction of these policies may actually mean that universities are subject to the charter when it comes to the protection of free speech on campus. Now, as I'm sure many of you already know, the courts in Alberta have said that with regard to some matters, universities are in fact subject to the Charter. The original decisions on this matter were by the Supreme Court of Canada that said universities are not government actors, they're not as a general rule subject to the Charter. But there is an opening in the court's jurisprudence that indicates that when a non-government actor is implementing something that we might describe as specific government policy, it may be viewed as engaging in government action, and that action may be subject to the Charter. So that's the argument, is that the introduction of these policies actually mean that universities in that particular respect may be engaged in government action. I don't think the courts in Ontario will or should say that, but it certainly is an anticipated change that is possible as a consequence of the introduction of these policies. And let me say, I mean, on the question of the Ontario government's not really grasping what it's doing, I recall that in the press release that accompanied this introduction of this requirement that universities all come up with free speech policies, Premier Ford said, well, it will nevertheless be the case that universities can prevent hateful speech from occurring on their campuses. And I thought, well, that's actually not how hate speech laws work. Hate speech laws operate after the fact, after someone has spoken and engaged in hateful expression. So in a sense, the Premier was confirming what many of us thought, that universities should in fact have the authority to prevent a speaker from speaking on campus if there are reasonable grounds to believe that that speaker may engage in hateful speech. But that wouldn't be just the ordinary application of the law onto campus. And again, I think it was just another indication that the Premier didn't really know, the government didn't really know what this was all about. It was all a matter of optics.
So my most prominent concern at the moment are those cases where we have speakers being invited, sometimes by outside organizations. UBC had speakers invited by organizations that had no affiliation with the university. They were fully outside bookings. And it was possible to see from someone having been on a speech tour what they were likely going to say. And it was possible to see that they would be transphobic statements, for instance, that challenge the existence of our trans faculty and students and staff. So in those cases, should a university not be able to go through steps and process to disinvite a speaker? So it's easy to imagine these days that there are extreme cases where that might be a wise action that universities should autonomously be able to take. But that's not been the way in which the Chicago principles have been discussed, that there's a very strong emphasis on never ever disinviting speakers if you follow the Chicago principles, unlike what Doug Ford seems to think.
So maybe I'll just say that I think, I think, and I know that Dick mentioned the sort of the different ways in which universities, operate. And I think the example that you just gave is, of sort of, we're renting an auditorium as a revenue tool, basically, and whether the same rules apply in that. I think the same rules don't have to apply in that context as they do when the university is acting as a university. I mean, similar issue came up. I know it came up in Vancouver and also here in Toronto with the invitation of Megan Murphy, who's considered to be, I guess, a radical feminist who a trans exclusionary radical feminist would be the label that many people would put on her. And the question was, why is the public library allowing this person to use space when the idea is that her views are denying the existence of a marginalized and vulnerable group. I mean, I think that there is a big difference between a public library that decides to invite someone like that as a speaker and a public library that, in this case, as was the case here, has a room rental policy and allows groups to use their rooms to host events. Now, that distinction was either lost on some or just considered not important. But the reality was that the Toronto Public Library as an institution had done an awful lot of work to make their spaces inclusive and diverse. And, despite people saying that you shouldn't have a drag queen story hour for young children, said, no, this is an activity that we're going to sponsor. But they also said, we have a policy when it comes to renting our rooms that unless the speech is criminal or contrary to the law, we're going to allow it. And their interpretation was that this was not contrary to the law. And I tend to agree with that interpretation. I think that there is, it's a very difficult issue, this idea that that some of this speech, denies the existence of people. I recognize how challenging that is, but I also think that that sometimes we need to have these conversations. And in the case of Meghan Murphy, what happened was that she was allowed to speak, and the group that was inside listening to her was dwarfed by the huge group outside that was protesting her. And to me, that's sort of free speech. That's free speech in action.
Thanks so much. So I just have one more question, so we leave ample time for the Q&A. Many, if not all of you, have mentioned that you don't buy this framing of a free speech crisis on campus necessarily, but that if you do have a principled commitment to free expression, that there are some challenges to it on campus in various forms. So in your mind, what would be welcome policies and practices to address the status quo on campus?
Well, I would really like to see more attention going to reconciling conflicting policies. So UBC has a statement for respectful environment, and it has a statement for freedom of expression. And they are not bound to coincide all the time. What are we to do when they don't?
I think one of the interesting things to think about for the governments that seem so concerned, the governments like the Alberta and Ontario government that seem so concerned about freedom of expression, is for them to put their money where their mouth is and to provide funding to institutions that is almost always borne by students who want to host events that are controversial, who are told that there's a security risk, and so you're going to have to pay a large sum so that we can make sure the environment is secure. If governments are saying these are the kinds of events that we want to ensure can happen, there's a price to that, and it shouldn't be borne by the students that are exercising their rights.
So I would say that what we in a sense need, and this is a kind of cliche, but I think there's some real truth to it, that we don't need less speech, we don't need less expression, we need more. And we have to understand that speech happens within a set of power relations. And so I think in order to address some of these imbalances which create vulnerabilities amongst certain identifiable groups, we need to give them more resources to be able to put their positions across, to be able to host the kinds of events that they'd like to see, to be able to challenge those groups, say on campus, that do possess a certain kind of institutional power and privilege. So I think that would be the way I would want to correct some of the power imbalances, as opposed to shutting things down. And I do think that there has been, over the last decade or so, a huge tendency towards deplatforming and canceling. And I don't think that benefits the level of public discourse as a whole. I think there's a real concern amongst, say, curators of museums, university administrators, and other institutional power holders that, you know, the public is just not mature enough to have a reasonable, informed, and critical discussion about difficult issues that we're confronting. So let's just not have those discussions. I do think this is part of it. And this was one of the things that one of the curators at the Tate, who wanted the Philip Guston show to appear there, was saying that there's a lack of trust in the public's ability to engage in reasonable discourse. So there's a kind of crisis of public reason, which does lead to, I wouldn't say necessarily crisis of freedom of expression, but real pressures on it, a real chilling effect on it. So I think we need to look at how we can address this from an institutional standpoint, not just from a policy or legalistic standpoint, which are important nonetheless.
To pick up on a couple of things that were said, Katja was talking about these two different policies. I mean, in a sense, any policy, whether we call it a free speech policy or respect policy, will struggle to reconcile those competing claims. And I think that's an unavoidable issue, and we may have different views about exactly how you reconcile or join those two things together. Free and open discussion matters at universities, and at the same time, we are a community with a particular purpose. And as I said in my opening remarks, we should be treating the members of that community with respect as members of a community, as individuals who should be addressed and heard from as part of a conversation. So that doesn't provide a simple answer, far from it. There will be lots of difficult cases about which side of the line we think things should fall on. Security costs are obviously a big issue. And the reality is, if we think the university is a state actor, and as I say, it's only to this point in Ontario that the university has been considered a state actor, but that may change. If we think that's the case, then there can be no justification for security costs. If individuals are exercising their free speech, they should not have to pay the cost of protection from those who would seek to shut them down. I think that's a simple fact. Now, if universities are not state actors, and of course we know they don't have unlimited resources, then maybe we look at this differently, but it's a real problem or a concern. In the US, they refer to this idea as the heckler's veto, as some of you may know, and that is shutting down the speaker because there are so many people who don't want them to speak and are willing to physically interfere with their speech. That cannot be the response that cannot be the response to speech that ought to be protected, that we shut it down because so many people want to interfere with it. But that's a real practical problem, the cost of it. And we all know, and we've seen it occasionally in this country, we've certainly seen it a lot in the States, that sometimes speakers are invited on campus not in order to speak, but in order to provoke a confrontation of some kind. And again, I don't know the simple answer to that, although the reality is when somebody like Ann Coulter was invited to speak at the University of Ottawa, well, Ann Coulter has engaged in enough speech in the United States that here in Canada would be regarded as hate speech. So it strikes me that the University of Ottawa could have gone even farther, although it would have been considered a very provocative act to have simply not permitted her to speak because of a history of hateful expression. But these are some of the real practical problems around security and security costs.
So we're going to open it up to the Q&A now.
Hello there, everybody. Thank you very much for this really fine event. Thanks to all the speakers. I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think that we should be thinking about the context, like the larger political context of a resurgence of right-wing politics worldwide in considering what's going on in the free speech debates? So I completely concur, with practically everything that everyone has said, but I wonder about the purchase, like what accounts for the purchase of free speech and and how exercised people have gotten about it. And also the fact that governments, yeah, okay, they're using it as optics and as theater, but why? And it seems to me that it's plausible to think that that there might be something bigger going on here in terms of student unions, being a source of critique of right-wing governments, of universities being still, even their corporate version, being a site of the generation of kind of critical thought, and to what extent there could be a kind of long game here around shutting down those or limiting those kinds of capacities, and exactly through strategies to provoke scandalous, encounters or events, and having some ways in which just to undermine the kind of historical role of the university in liberal societies that are on the way perhaps to becoming more illiberal.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. That's an excellent question. In fact, I tend to want to look at the situation in North America and Canada in particular in the global frame, and that's really how we framed our book, Spectres of Fascism, looking at the rise of something like fascism, although it is specters of fascism, in not just in the United States and in Europe, but also looking at places like Brazil and India. And I think in both of those cases, we see the universities as being attacked, academic freedom as being attacked, and freedom of expression on campus and within society at large is really under fire. Here it gets framed as a kind of right-wing issue, but I think if you look at it globally, if you look at what's going on in Bangladesh, for example, Pakistan, it is very much still a left position to insist upon freedom of expression. I was at the University of Sao Paulo teaching there a couple of years ago, just after Bolsonaro got elected, and people may recall that during the election itself, police entered the campuses of Brazil universities. They went into the classrooms and took down posters that were pro-human rights, because this was said to be too political. It was politicizing the students too much, according to the state authorities. So I think that this is an important kind of frame to keep in mind, that the university is, in a sense, despite it becoming increasingly corporate in nature, its relative autonomy is still a space that can be taken up and occupied for critical voices that are going to challenge governments like Bolsonaro's, Erdogan's in Turkey, and of course Modi in India.
If I could pick up on one part of the question, and that is the use of the term free speech, and how in this odd way we've come to associate with conservative perspectives. In fact, I have T-shirts, because what I do, that have free speech on it. I walk down the street now and I'm kind of suddenly realizing people might be looking at me as some right-wing political ideologue as a consequence of defending free speech. Cara, you may be totally familiar with this. And I mean, it's striking the way in which the term has come to be used in this kind of partisan and strategic way. Now, of course, there are lots of reasons for it. And I can look back and think back to when Ernst Zundel, Holocaust denier, was tried in a very complicated way under a particular provision of the criminal code. But he would present himself as a defender of free speech, because that's a more palatable way to present yourself. Instead of defending the odious, hateful views, Holocaust denial, and other things that somebody like Zundel would put forward, he can then present himself at another level as a defender of free speech. And that becomes a far more palatable way to present yourself. So I think that's one thing that's going on, but it's also used in a strategic way as a way of trying to affirm the idea of Western civilization. It's we recognize, we protect these fundamental rights, new immigrants, for example, they don't necessarily fully appreciate these values. So it has also a kind of racist, culturist idea behind it as well when it's used in this fashion. Now, if truth be told, we learn and we discover very quickly that that many of those, certainly on the extreme right, who defend free speech do not have a deep commitment to that. And immediately when there is something that they don't agree with, they're pretty quick to withhold the protection of free speech from it.
There was a case in front of the BC Human Rights Tribunal recently. The Morgane Auger, when she was running for election in the provincial government, had Bill Westcott organizing against with transphobic speech, including on our campus. And so that's one of those cases where I think a number of issues coincide in sharp ways. So one is that there was a direct attempt to curtail the participation of a trans woman in elected politics. And it happened also including on a campus. And so years later, the BC Human Rights Tribunal makes a decision in favor of Auger, but these kinds of attempts to seriously limit participation of people with certain identities in our politics and in our universities continue or can continue. So what's the place of universities in making those decisions on the ground, or what's the room for them to make those decisions on the ground and not waiting and letting people incur cost of human rights challenges years down the road.
Okay, thank you, Dax, for organizing this event, and thank you all guys for these enlightening presentations. I think the issue of freedom of speech is a bit, I don't know, more complex or complicated than what we think it is. If you take the example of France and the defamation of the Prophet Muhammad, a prophet that over 2 billion people, Muslims actually in the world, believe in, I don't think this is, freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech is free until you begin to hurt the other one, until you begin to deny their even very existence. A Zionist who is giving, a free speech in my university, and who is going to tell me that Israel, was established after 3,000 years of being, denied that part, I think is not someone that I'm going to respect or even sit there until they finish, their presentation, because he basically is telling me that I don't exist. The thing is, within the Canadian context, unfortunately, racialization of Palestinians is taking place as we are speaking right now. You all know the case of Professor Faisal Baba from Law Department and at York University. Now, this professor actually, just for giving a public speech and saying that Zionism is is a supremacist movement, was received death threats from pro-Israel, pro-Zionist organizations here in Canada. This is one case. Another case, there is a professor that I know personally from Toronto University, who also, instead of her or him actually receiving direct threats went to the department and to the university asking to fire her. Again, simply because speaking about one Palestinian cultural icon who came up with the whole notion of resistance culture. that is Ghassan Kanafani. And just for doing that, which is, a research on culture, on resistance culture, they received this sort of threat. That the rescinding of a job offer at University of Toronto to Azarova is also a case that, does not, it talks about what I think one of the colleagues here, Samir, was talking about, the becoming of our university, becoming, part of the whole, if you want, capitalist system, because the government is not giving sufficient funds, and they get the funds from private, donors. These private donors happen to have money, but also they want, they have their own demands. It's not for the sake of, for the sake of love of Carleton or any other university that they donate their money. So my point here is, I really feel, as a Palestinian and as a scholar, there is a crisis when it comes to the question of Zionism, when it comes to the question of, Palestinian human rights and, the fight for human rights. So for those of you who do not, still believe in a crisis.
I hate to cut you off, Nala, but I really want to do justice to the few remaining questions and the hands up. So there's lots to delve into there. So some of the panelists have talked about the IHRA working definition anti-Semitism already, and you've diagnosed already quite a few contradictions about speech on campus. So I'll also ask the panelists to be super brief in responding to this, because I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to you after this, and also get the hands that are up right now.
I might have to kind of, promote my own work. So I have a book about, entitled "Putting Faith in Hate: When Religion is a Source or Subject of or Target of Hate Speech." And so a large element of that book, of course, is about criticism or mockery or ridicule of beliefs and sacred or venerated symbols or persons in different religious traditions. Now, there was a lot to that last question or comment, and so I can't really respond to all of it. Generally speaking, free speech law distinguishes between attacks on persons or groups, which, if extreme enough, can count as hate speech on the one hand, and on the other hand, attacks on beliefs or ideas, which ought to be protected. Now, of course, the distinction between these two things in practice is not always clear, and that raises a variety of questions. But anyway, I'll say no more than that. I certainly agree that there are a variety of issues, obviously, around different political communities, different political movements, and obviously the Israel-Palestine has been a real issue at universities for sure.
Okay, I have a question that came via email. This is from Shannon. She asks, Cara drew a distinction between university-sponsored events and events by external groups renting university space, and suggested that universities have different responsibilities vis-a-vis these two classes of events. However, some external groups choose to rent university space because the university venue gives the event the imprimatur of scholarly respectability. I would like to hear Cara and other panelists' perspectives. I'm going to say just Cara in the interest of time. On whether that troubles the distinction that Cara drew. And just a quick note to let Judy and Anas that I'll get to your raised hands in just a moment.
Yeah, I mean, it does. Sure, it definitely does trouble the distinction if the goal is, to have the university's sort of imprimatur on an event and give it that credibility. I think that was the same issue that came up in the library example that I mentioned. The idea was that for many people, it wasn't obvious that this wasn't a library-sponsored event. It was being held at the library, and so there was every reason to believe that it sort of had that. And so I think, I'm not sure how to address it. I'm not sure if there's obviously ways that you can sort of that the university steps that the university might take to make clear sort of what events they're endorsing and what events they're just, geographically the geographic host of. But I also think, part of the point of my comment was to say that I think there is less of a responsibility to justify decisions that are made in that context of renting rooms. I think it's when the university is acting as university that it has more of an obligation to, not to discriminate on the basis of viewpoint, right? The comment that Dick made about, this difference between attacks on individuals and groups and attacks on beliefs and ideas, which is definitely not always a clear line, but I think that the university has a bit more margin, I guess, in those kind of room rental scenarios. And I just want to comment on the previous comment about the issue of Israel-Palestine on campus, and obviously very fraught area. But I think the comment that started that that discussion was that freedom of expression only extends so far until someone is hurt by it, and to me that's wrong. I mean, that's not what freedom of expression is, and if that's what freedom of expression is, then it's meaningless. We don't need a constitutional protection for freedom of expression if it only protects things that no one has an issue with. It's the fact that people contest these ideas and debate them that's the reason why we've decided to enshrine this principle in our Constitution.
When Janet, who asked the first question, spoke, she mentioned student unions. And as those of you at the U of A know, we had a very confounding situation here in 2019 when a contract instructor shared views on Facebook, I think it was, denying the Holodomor and using our spiffy new Chicago principles. Many faculty members, including friends of mine, including some people who are here, with whom I almost always disagree, with whom I almost always agree on the content of politics, defended this person on the basis of our spiffy new free speech principles against criticism, really well-crafted, genuine criticism coming from students, articulated by the president of our students union, who is a very impressive political science student, and progressives who do not deny the Holodomor, I guarantee you. And if that criticism had come from somebody other than this particular speaker, somebody coming from the left rather than the right, they would never have defended that speech, and they defended it. Students were extremely upset that their feminist, progressive professors signed that memo, signed that petition to support that free speech. So the question is, who is the university? Is it the students or is it the professors?
Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to do something I'm uncomfortable doing, which is limiting the expression of the panelists. I'd like, however, for one of you to give a really, really brief response to Judy's questions, and then unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up. Would any of you like to offer a quick word?
I'm not familiar with the details of the case, but to me, it would be very important to assert that that person's employment situation was not affected by the criticism, or that there wouldn't be calls to not employ that person on the basis of speech in outside the university.
Okay, thanks so much. I'd like you all to join me in thanking all of the panelists for this excellent and I hope stimulating event. In lieu of thunderous applause for all of them in a tightly packed auditorium, I'm hoping you will instead email them and say, good job, and I loved listening to you. And if you still have lingering questions, also remember that the conversation doesn't have to stop here. I'm sure each of the panelists would love to hear from you if you do have some particular questions about what you've just heard. I'm going to pass over to David really quickly, who's going to talk a bit about some upcoming events in the Department of Political Science at Alberta.
Thank you. I'd like to just add our appreciation of Dax, who's done a tremendous amount to draw together this panel, which is around his own PhD research, which you should look for in other venues. Thanks to everyone who participated in a wonderful conversation.